Hello, my name is Susan Shaheen, and I'm the chair of the TRB Executive Committee. I'm delighted to introduce our Dean Lecture Honoree. The Thomas B. Deen Distinguished Lectureship was established in 1992 as the Transportation Research Board Distinguished Lectureship. 10 years later, the award was renamed in honor of the board's 8th executive director, Tom Deen, who served with distinction from 1980 to 1994. The 2022 recipient of the Thomas B. Deen Distinguished Lectureship is Anne Strauss-Wieder. Ms. Strauss-Wieder is Director of Freight Planning at the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority. She is recognized for her contributions to the transportation community in freight mobility, resilience and business continuity, and freight as a good neighbor, effective practices. With more than 40 years of public and private sector experience involving supply chains, resilience, and multimodal freight movement, she has authored numerous assessments of emerging trends and issues at ports, in industry, and in freight operations. In her current role, she works proactively on addressing key regional freight issues and trends, and is also responsible for expanding collaborations with private sector organizations and partner agencies to create region-wide and multi-state involvement in advancing freight initiatives, policies, and actions. Her work additionally includes numerous other initiatives that increase the awareness, effectiveness, and value of freight operations on a national level. Anne Strauss-Wieder is an active TRB volunteer and has virtually uninterrupted service as a member of TRB committees, task forces, sections, groups, and panels since 1985. She is a past chair of the Freight Systems Group, the Standing Committee on Freight Transportation Planning and Logistics, and the National Cooperative Highway Research Program panel on characteristics and growth of freight transportation demand. She currently chairs the section on transportation system resilience. In recognition of her service to TRB, in 2005, she was named as an emeritus member of the Standing Technical Committee on Freight Transportation, Planning, and Logistics. In addition to her service to TRB, Ms. Strauss-Wieder has served or is serving in leadership roles in several national professional organizations, including the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals and the Commercial Real Estate Development Association. She is an appointed member of the U.S. Department of Commerce's Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness and served as a member of the U.S. Maritime Administration's Marine Transportation System National Advisory Committee. She also developed and teaches a graduate course on freight and public policy at Rutgers University. I'd like to give a warm welcome to our 2022 Thomas B. Deen Distinguished Lecturer.
Thank you. The good news is we don't have to explain what supply chains are anymore. However, the bad news is that we don't have to explain what supply chains are anymore. The movement of freight, which for so long has been behind the curtain for most people, is now front and center. While not all the news is good, it does mean that the importance of freight for the health and well-being of communities, for businesses, for our nation and the world is now on full display and getting attention. My lecture is going to take a look back in time, the context for freight movement, the demands that we have placed on the system as consumers and in terms of business and product movement, the kind of freight services that have been provided and how that's evolved, the role of the public sector, and the conversations and the analyses that have taken place with the Transportation Research Board. Because with this understanding of the evolutions, the challenges, the opportunities, the achievements over the last several decades, we set the stage for how we're going to provide a freight system that meets the evolving needs of the 21st century. And as we talk about the system, think about it in terms of 3 layers. The physical movement of goods, whether it's vessels or aircraft, truck or rail, industrial buildings, or all the equipment at the various facilities needed to move products. And then information flows. And because we're going back several decades, don't just think digital, think of all the paperwork, financial transactions, bills of lading, transportation orders, customs documents, all the documentations, all the information needed to make the movement of goods possible. And third, and equally important, government rules and regulations that set the playing field for the movement of goods. So let's start back in the 70s and 80s, a time of great change and challenges for the freight system. The largest corporations in the United States were in production, whether it was automobiles, General Motors, Ford, General Electric, IBM, those big mainframes, energy companies. And in terms of us, the consumers, the big established retailers were Kmart and Sears, and the amazing Sears catalog. So you didn't have to go to the store. You could leaf through the catalog that had everything in it and place a mail order, or maybe even call by phone. But these established retailers were being challenged by a lot of new entries in the marketplace. Walmart, which had been established in the 1960s, expanded nationally in the 1970s. Price Club Costco was formed. Staples, Home Depot, Office Max, Office Depot, Aeropostale, Ralph Lauren. Stores that focused on specific segments of the market, offered big discounts or big quantities, or new ways to shop. The Home Shopping Network, QVC, was formed. And the information age was expanding beyond those massive mainframe computers and into our offices and into our homes. Apple Computers was formed. IBM introduced their personal computer in 1981. Gateway was formed, Dell and Northgate. Lotus 1-2-3 was offered. The first barcode was scanned, involved juicy fruit gum, that's in the Smithsonian Museum, at a supermarket. The first cell phone, now admittedly several pounds and over $4,000, but information flow was moving into our world. And we began to shift in terms of where we worked. In the beginning, we may have worked in manufacturing or distribution, but we were shifting from working in manufacturing as a U.S. economy to working more in services, moving from working on the factory floor or in distribution and into that office environment. Meanwhile, there were changes afoot in the freight industry. The railroads in particular were in need of rescue. And indeed, through the 3R Act and the 4R Act, the federal government stepped in and rescued the railroad industry. They took 7 railroads, including 2 that were bankrupt, one of them the Penn Central, and created Conrail in 1976. Meanwhile, a gentleman by the name of Fred Smith wasn't too happy with the package delivery he was getting. So he got a few trucks and got a couple of small planes, and he set up a package delivery company. But he quickly learned that having just small planes wasn't going to cut it with the kind of demand there was for that service. So, Federal Express, among others, lobbied the federal government and through an Air Cargo Act, enabled them to also use larger aircraft. And thus was born an industry that focused on that end need positively, absolutely getting it to you by 10:30 the next morning, whether that took a truck or an aircraft or something in between. The first multimodal, intermodal, integrated company surfaced. And not only that, it wasn't just involving truck and air. Malcolm McLean, who established the container business in 1956, started looking in the 1970s at taking two of those containers and stacking them on a rail car. Eventually, American President Lines, working with the railroads, established the first land bridge service, but they couldn't do it without federal legislation, including the Shipping Act, which allowed the railroads to issue the kind of contracts needed to allow the ocean carriers to provide this service. So the private sector started going intermodal with the assistance of the federal government. Indeed, it was a period when federal legislation changed the entire playing field across modes. The Regional Rail Reorganization Act of 1974 and the 4R Act 2 years later that established Conrail, the Staggers Act that reinvigorated the railroads, the Air Cargo Act, which enabled Federal Express and others, the Shipping Act, which helped establish land bridge services, and the Motor Carrier Act of 1980, which essentially deregulated the entire motor carrier industry. Now, in terms of investment, the federal government was primarily focused on finishing the interstate highway network. And in terms of modes, we were still pretty siloed. In terms of rail and truck and air and ocean, intermodal is beginning to happen. And at the Transportation Research Board annual meeting, sometimes we were happy to get 10 people in a room. But the folks talking about freight were pretty dedicated and realized they were talking about something important and tried to get the word out to others. And the world was about to get a lot bigger and a lot more intermodal. Global change occurred at a fairly rapid rate, and international trade bloomed. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. A year later, Germany was reunified. A year after that, the Soviet Union dissolved. And 2 years after that, in 1993, the European Union was formed and the creation of the euro. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was enacted in 1994. The World Trade Organization established a year later in 1995, with China joining it in 2001. International trade was encouraged. And it wasn't just trade, but it was a sharing of ideas. Now, Henry Ford had established the idea of a production line, but in Japan, the idea of lean management, of having inventory just in time for use on the assembly line, really blossomed and then became known throughout the world in a book called The Machine That Changed the World. And just-in-time and lean manufacturing spread as a practice. Indeed, Michael Dell, with his Dell computers, he didn't assemble that machine until the order was placed, which also meant he then had to rely on very efficient freight transportation to get that computer to the customer in a reasonable time. Freight became part of the customer experience. And we were changing in terms of the largest corporations. Yes, still very heavily in the manufacturing. General Motors, Ford, GE is still there. IBM now expanded into personal computers. Energy, ExxonMobil, but we have two stores in there, Walmart and Sears, in the top of the Fortune 100. And the largest retailers, Sears and Walmart, JCPenney, the big K, Kmart, a number of supermarket chains, and the forerunners of Target. But there was change afoot. 1984, a bookstore took advantage of that new world of the internet and established the first online bookstore, Amazon. Meanwhile, Woolworth, which had been around for decades, well, the five and dime failed because of all the new retail opportunities out there. Change was afoot. And certainly the internet blossomed. AOL started sending out floppy disks and CDs, inviting every household to join. So did CompuServe. Yahoo offered a search engine. Two guys formed a company named Google. A cell phone could access the internet and you could type messages and get email on it. And a document was issued that said how to timestamp a digital document. A theoretical idea that eventually would blossom into something called blockchain. So the information age is there. We were consuming quite a bit, not producing as much as we used to, and international trade was blooming. With more cargo moving, it made sense to have bigger container vessels because it reduced the cost per container. So in 1980, we had a vessel that could hold 4,100 20-foot equivalent units, or TEUs. That's a 20-foot container. Then by 1997, it had doubled in size. By 2021, there was a vessel that can hold 24,000 TEUs. Warehouses were no longer the place where you lost the Ark, as we saw in the last scene of the first Indiana Jones movie. And the term distribution center was not a rebranding, but it was really a change in function, because with longer supply chains came the idea of bifurcating the production process so that final assembly, the final customization could go on at that distribution center. So the distribution center was no longer just a cost function, it was a profit center where value was added to the products moving through it. And these facilities grew in size and function, both in height and in physical dimension. So indeed, we started seeing buildings going over 1 million square feet. Today, we can talk about buildings that were well over 2 million square feet and industrial spaces under 5,000 because of the changing. And the technology that were in these buildings, first place where we really saw barcodes coming into use, scanning of those codes, a lot of conveyor systems. And indeed, these were microcosms of the technological changes that we would see later on throughout the freight industry and the transportation industry. What a change in the railroads, from just about an utter despair to reinvigorated. The Burlington Northern and the Santa Fe merged, the UP merged with the Southern Pacific. Conrail went public and brought a big profit back to the federal government, and by the way, was acquired then by Norfolk Southern and CSX. The highway system was basically finished. And in 1991 came the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, ICE-T. Intermodal was part of the headline. And indeed, it shifted away from the modal silos, and it opened up the transportation process to a lot more people and local involvement. Freight became a topic of conversation in a whole new set of forums, and it blossomed within the Transportation Research Board. At the annual meeting, lots of people in lots of bigger rooms and lots more conversations about how freight could be a good neighbor or how to advance those freight operations and make it work in community settings and in economic development and in terms of environmental considerations and others. It became part of the conversation. And now we move into the 21st century, which perhaps started not so well. And we're not talking about Y2K, but the horrific events of 9/11. We faced new challenges, but out of those challenges came new opportunities, new abilities to collaborate and communicate and coordinate and get things done, and really set the stage further. For the first time on 9/11, we saw that transportation equipment could be used as weapons of mass destruction. Prior to that, we talked about security and freight. It was to reduce theft and shrinkage, but now we had to consider terrorist activity. So we saw federal legislation established, organizations set up, CTPAT, CSI, the full scanning of every cargo placed on aircraft, scanning of containers, geofencing, using technology to monitor how those trucks moved, but looking at all the additional need to know who your shippers were, to know what was in those containers, to understand every bit of the operation, whether international or domestic, came a new understanding. And again, that need for collaboration and communication and cooperation. And they're found additional ways to save money, to create more efficiencies, and to increase the visibility, not just for security purposes, but also for customers. So all of a sudden, you could consider inventory that was in transit because you knew exactly where it was, and you knew it could be secure. And if something happened to it in transit, if the temperature got too high for it, you knew about it. So out of a terrible situation and out of a need for thinking through transportation security, also came additional understanding and additional efficiencies and abilities in freight. And we were challenged, and not just by terrorist events. Whether we're talking Katrina or Superstorm Sandy or the terrible disaster in Fukushima in 2011, or the explosion in Beirut, or the fires, or the earthquakes, or the tsunamis, or the massive snowstorms. Resilience became part of the conversation. How to sustain communities through such events, how to sustain the movement of essential goods through such events, whether it was through infrastructure investment, or really taking a look at that freight system in terms of the information and whether you could flex things in terms of modes, or as we learned with Fukushima in 2011 when that occurred, you couldn't just have a production facility in one location in the world because there was only one plant. It was located in Fukushima that made an essential element for metallic paint for cars and trucks, and it was offline. And it took out auto and truck manufacturing around the world. So diversification of production location, flexibility, monitoring, risk assessment, thinking through the infrastructure, thinking through the system, thinking about how to flex and make it happen. And we continue to evolve. Yes, we still had General Electric and energy production in there, but now Walmart is the largest corporation in the United States, and a bank, a financial institution, is in those top 5. Freight became more than the movement of goods, it became a market strategy. Amazon introduced Prime in 2005. For one fee, you got free delivery, and all of a sudden, free delivery became the new benchmark for retail. You had to offer free or you're not going to succeed in your business. But then it wasn't just free delivery, it was 2-day delivery, then 1-day delivery, then same-day delivery. And that really challenged the brick and mortar stores and the retail industry. Freight became part of the market strategy. It became part of the customer experience even more than before. And the brick and mortar landscape changed. Lifett's Furniture went out of business, Circuit City bankrupt. Borders Bookstore, no more. Radio Shack, Aeropostale, Sports Authority. If the retailer could not adapt to having an e-commerce component as well as brick and mortar and a mail order, they no longer succeeded. And international trade continued to grow. And as it grew, we had to look at the infrastructure, whether it was the raising of the Bayonne Bridge in New Jersey to accommodate the height of the new vessels, or deepening the channels throughout the US, or creating a new lock and dam system in the Panama Canal, or seeing vessels such as the one at the bottom that holds 24,000 containers. So we had to adapt our infrastructure to meet the needs of international trades and us, the consumers. And those distribution centers, with the technology ahead of everyone else, they continue to evolve. The little orange robots there, first they were named Kivas and Amazon acquired them. It was discovered that those associates picking our orders were spending a lot of time walking up and down aisles. So why not have the goods come to them? And that's what the Kiva robots did. So a lot of picking and packing, and in some cases automation to do all that. And they were no longer distribution centers, but they were fulfilling our orders. And the type of freight providers evolved as well, most notably Amazon, which emerged as an integration of the shipper and a transportation provider, not only for their own goods, but also for the goods they stored at their facilities, and them going into air and going into trucking. And by last year, in 2021, becoming one of the top delivery services to customers in the United States. And speaking of that last mile, all these new services to serve us, whether it's Instacart or Uber Eats or Shipit, all these services to service us, the consumer. And technology advancement continued, particularly with a lot more information and automation tech out there, whether we're talking about automated trucks, and the first one being a delivery of Budweiser beer in Core Country, or drones. The first delivery, by the way, by a drone was beer to ice fishermen. That's not to say that beer is an indicator of advancement in freight, because Zipline was delivering critical medical supplies in Africa in disrupted situations, and more recently is now working with Marwork to deliver product from pharmacies in the Arkansas area, the same way that UPS teamed up with CVS to offer drone services to deliver prescriptions to the villages in Florida, a retirement community during the pandemic. We saw some new technologies come in, sidewalk robots, whether we're talking Starship or KiwiBots, particularly the delivery of product. And you see these at a number of college campuses and in some urban areas, or the first automated vessel, also electric, in Scandinavia. So we're looking at new technologies and automation that doesn't necessarily replace the worker, but changes the nature of the job for workers in the freight industry. And tremendous push to make all these operations more environmentally sustainable, to reduce the carbon footprint, not just because it was good for the bottom line, because we also asked of it, and because freight is a good neighbor. Whether it's solar on the roofs of industrial properties or a number of the environmental mitigation factors in these facilities, such as recycling and air tubes and all sorts of light tubes, to really have a LEED certified building. Whether we're talking about electric or CNG trucks for long distance, particularly between known origins and destinations for refueling or recharging purposes, Amazon, FedEx, UPS introducing electric trucks. Again, these are a private fleet. They go home at night. They can charge for home delivery. And not just limited to trucks or industrial buildings, but seeing new technologies, more sustainable technologies in locomotives, in vessel design, in aircraft fuel. And information and physical movement came together. In the 2000s, we saw big recalls of peanut butter, broccoli, spinach, big concerns about accountability and the ability to quickly remove product if food became contaminated. Walmart and IBM got together and created a blockchain accountability starting at the field all the way through to the grocery store. So they could track the food, and if it had to be recalled, it could not only be recalled quickly, but could figure out where that source of infection was. And then blockchain also looked at international trade, and IBM and Maersk created trade lens, which then extended to ports around the world, again to facilitate the movement. And in 2015, the TRB Young Professional 6-minute pitch winner was Transfix, a company that looked at load matching, helping truckers try to find a load so they weren't moving empty from one place to another. So reduce the vehicle miles traveled, increase the revenue by trucks, and by the way, that 6-minute pitch winner is now worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A merging of information and physical movement of goods to create more efficiency, more accountability, more visibility. And here we are today, facing new challenges and looking for new opportunities. International trade, which had been encouraged for so long, began to unravel. China launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, which then was looked at with caution by other nations in terms of China securing freight facilities and certain sources of raw materials. The United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union in 2016, Brexit. That same year, Hanjin, a major container line, went bankrupt suddenly, with customers wondering where their containers were. In 2018, tariffs were introduced on goods coming from overseas by the United States, by China, and in Europe. In 2020, the UK completed the Brexit move and left the European Union, and a global pandemic hit us and showed us even more that international trade was unraveling. The global health emergency, which has cost us millions of lives and has been a tremendous tragedy throughout the world, showed us all the issues involved with international trade and very, very long supply chains. As production went offline in certain countries, vessel moves were canceled. And indeed, we had a situation where the freight industry was trying very hard to meet an abrupt change in the demand for products, a huge increase in the need for personal protective equipment, cleaning supplies, food, household items, toilet paper. And at the same time, a sharp decrease in the needs for restaurants and for office buildings, and trying to make those adjustments, both in production and knowing that certain production's offline, while trying to keep workers safe and keeping the goods moving, was a tremendous challenge that was met head on by a lot of courageous people throughout the entire supply chain industry and in the public sector. We bought a lot more because we were sheltering in place. But e-commerce couldn't just be called those little packages coming to our homes. Let's call it now direct to consumer, because it involved food deliveries and gym equipment and furniture. If we include all of that in e-commerce, we saw that the e-commerce share of the total retail market grew substantially. That market penetration probably accelerated by at least 3 years, and again, expanded out to more than just simple packages. Prior to the pandemic, there was an option to buy online and pick up in stores known as BOPUS. And not a lot of people used it. It may have been convenient because you could get it right there. And for stores, it was great because it could use the inventory on hand, use their brick and mortar stores. And by the way, when you came in to pick it up, maybe you bought something else in the meantime. But this extended beyond going to Target. It extended to grocery stores and other areas. And indeed, we found we liked this service. It was really good. We found we could rely on either having groceries delivered to us or more conveniently, picking it up and just going into that supermarket parking lot, popping the trunk, and the goods were loaded in and off we went. And indeed, we see on this graph here that online, that BOPUS sale of groceries was fairly low in 2019 and has extended as we have grown to really see the benefits of it. But at the same time, grocery stores were never set up for BOPUS. They were set for us to go through those aisles picking goods, not for their workers to go through and pick goods. So what did that mean? Because there was a shortage of workers and a lot more demand. So in less than a year, the freight industry met that challenge and created a micro distribution center module that could be put into the grocery store or at a facility right nearby, including robotics that were sensitive enough to not damage fruit and vegetables that were picked by that machine. So again, the freight industry adapted because of our changing demands placed on it. As a country, we realized we had to rethink both having inventory on hand and our domestic production capacity. Even prior to the pandemic, we were realizing with really long supply chains that just in time was really turning into just in case, and we need to have more inventory on hand. But what we really saw happen was a rethinking because of those disruptions that we've all experienced in the supply chain, that we needed more inventory on hand, which is why we're seeing an increase in the demand for industrial property as well. In terms of that industrial property, that huge increase in delivery to consumer. But we also recognize as a country early on that not only did we have to reserve vaccine production capacity, but that we had to think through our ability to manage and produce syringes, vials, and needles, because we didn't make enough of that within the United States. And indeed, BARDA, the federal agency, started investing, not only increasing the production capacity in these areas, but also thinking through the next level of production, how to do it better. Perhaps layers of glass in those glass vials, because you needed glass near the vaccine material, but how did you reduce the breakage in travel? Again, as we learned with Fukushima, that diversification of production location, whether it's furniture manufacturing coming back to the States, or again, vaccine production. And supply chains were in the news, and the criticality understood. One of the first acts by President Biden was to issue an executive order looking at the critical supply chains and seeing the analyses and what had to be done. Then came the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 that not only invested substantially in our transportation systems, but also recognized other systems that we need to have in place to make sure the goods flow and our communities and our economies flourish. It also considered some of the issues that had existed prior to the pandemic, but were really heightened during the global health emergency, such as the need for truck parking, because a truck parking analysis is now required as part of the updates of the state freight plans. And opening the door for under 21 drivers to responsibly have a ladder to get an interstate commercial driver's license, and then looking at the shortage of truck drivers and recognizing there were underrepresentation by women, who were about 7% of the workforce, and minorities, and created an action plan to strengthen that trucking workforce. And what do we look like? Well, in 2021, well, we had one production company in the top 5, Apple, Walmart, Amazon, 2 healthcare companies at the top of the Fortune 100. We have a lot more technologies. We have a lot more modes emerging. We have a lot more ways in what freight are moving. But as we have seen, through collaboration, through coordination, through communication, through innovation, we've taken on these challenges. We've seized those opportunities. And we have seen how we've evolved to meet these changing demands. Thank you very much. A major thanks to everyone at the Transportation Research Board for the tremendous honor of providing this lecture. And thank you to my wonderful family for over the years that I've taken you to industrial buildings and ports, pointed out air cargo and trucks and railroads, as you have tried to explain what your mother does in freight and supply chain. Thank you. To everyone here who lived through these times, saw these challenges, seized these opportunities, saw the achievements. I hope this was a good look back at what is possible and what was achieved. And for those of you new to freight and new to TRB, I hope that this lecture inspires you by everything that has happened and what has been achieved to create more and achieve more as we move into the future. Thank you again.